Mm-hmm. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. And then we'll look at the text itself. Yeah. Now, just wanted to go over the material we've covered in the present chapter, which is really what comes in terms of the training. This, of course, is vast, and in the Mahayana scriptures, we have some enormous amount of teachings about the implications of the Bodhisattva training. You know, so much emerged in India in the early centuries of the Common Era, prior to Buddhism arriving in Tibet, really because India was such a multicultural, it was so multicultural. And in this way, it actually, you could say, in the dialogue and the conversations that took place, the Buddhist masters very compassionately, continually taught very much to clarify the nature of the Buddhist teaching. Of course, they could have just said, this is how it is. But because they were in this, you could say, dialectic, or you could say conversational context with so many other teachings, really to clarify and to prevent misunderstanding, there emerged this enormous corpus of what we then refer to as the Shastras, the works by the great masters such as Nagarjuna and Asanga, and also the likes of Shantideva, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, and so on. And so there really was, you could say, an incredibly compassionate engagement with the times there. And so that's where we have so much teachings on the Bodhisattva trainings. And of course, you have the way of the Bodhisattva, you have the teachings on the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara and many others that now have been translated. But what we have here really is more of a pith instruction for practitioners. And so in some way, we refer to the Treasury of Precious Qualities as being, well, as it was said, you know, this is sort of the elucidation, further elucidations on what is known as the Great Vehicle, Shinta Chenmo, which was Longchen Pa's auto-commentary on the first volume of Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. And where we actually have, now we have Woolston Fletcher's really excellent exposition that includes a lot of that. He and Helena translated the root text, but then Woolston over the last couple of years has been going over the root text of the first 8 chapters, and doing that, drawing on this work, the Shinta Chenmo, the Great Vehicle, but no, the Great Chariot. But it's mentioned that the Treasury of Precious Qualities actually is what further, you could say, supports that teaching. And all of this very much is you know, geared towards practitioners. So even though you could say, oh, it's a big, you know, if you have both volumes, there they are, you know, it looks very substantial. But actually, in comparison to what we have in the Mahayana teachings available in terms of pith instructions, or rather, you could say detailed instructions on the Bodhisattva trainings, this is actually Upadesha, it is actually pith instruction. And so we've covered quite a bit of material presently, and we are now in the 9th chapter, which is then on the trainings of the Bodhisattva. And there, Jigme Lingpa, he first, or rather, Kangyur Rinpoche, in quoting on this on Jigme Lingpa's text, he brings home the point of how once we take the Bodhisattva vow, this is different from just taking a Bodhisattva vow which has to do with our personal discipline, our personal path. This is really a big deal because it's really that place where we're expanding our vision of our spirituality to really be a dedication to the cause of all sentient beings. And that's where we can't really go back on that. This actually has a big shift in terms of our attitude towards the world. It's not so much about what's in it for me, how could the spiritual path benefit me? How could I become free of samsara? But really a complete dedication to sentient beings in terms of, you could say, conventional attitude, and of course also embracing the great vision of what we could call mahashunyata, or the great understanding of emptiness. And that's where we have these two aspects, the insight of emptiness as wisdom, and then the dedication to sentient beings as the compassion. And that's where we bring home the point then of this, the value of this in these lines here that Kangyur Rinpoche quotes from the Way of the Bodhisattva, about how this is something that we can't give up on. We should never give up on it. And there he quotes Shantideva, who says, "How can I expect a happy destiny if from the heart I summon wandering beings to the highest bliss, but then deceive and fail them?" So that's where we don't want to do that. There is a very sweet, rather cute story about, who was it? Can't remember if it was Shariputra or Subhuti, but one of the Arhat students of the Buddha, who took the Bodhisattva vow, was intending to embrace the Mahayana path, but got fed up. And the story goes that he vowed to follow the Bodhisattva path without holding back any of his dearest possessions, including his own body. And it said that Mara then manifested, whoever it was, Indra maybe, but anyway, to test him, came and said, "Okay, I'd like your right arm." And the student of the Buddha, very correctly then, cut off his right arm and handed it to this manifestation with his left hand, which is the only one he had. And as some of you who traveled in India, you know, then the left hand is not something that you don't shake people with your left hand, you don't touch people with your left hand, you don't give presents with your left hand, because your left hand is usually dedicated to you could say foul aspects of personal hygiene. So handing this right arm to Mara with his left hand, Mara went, "Oh, that's disgusting. I don't want that." and the poor Ahadi then thought, "I can't do this. I just can't do this." So that's sort of taking it as an example of how some might get discouraged. And that's also, you could say, somewhat linked up to the injunction that we often have in the Mahayana, where it says, you know, we shouldn't extend our practice of the Mahayana beyond what we're capable of. So, you know, even though there is stories of the Buddha in his previous lives as Bodhisattva giving his own body, then that's not recommended. And it's recommended that we abide by our own capacity. But what we're looking at presently is then in terms of our attitude, and that's where we have the two bodhicittas of aspiration and then application. And that's where we then presently are merely talking about the aspiration, which is this attitude that we will not give up on sentient beings. We're going to be there, we're going to follow through, and of course, we might sometimes fail, but that doesn't mean that we give up. So there's a complete commitment to this cause of all sentient beings, as per this quote. So we've looked at then what needs to be, what the trainings consist of, and particularly in terms of we looked at what needs to be avoided. And also, if we do have, which inevitably we do, and that's the beauty also of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha's teaching takes into account, you could say, our neurosis and our habitual patterns. I mean, the Buddha could just have talked about, you could say, non-dual, clear light, and just settling into the bliss of nirvana and, sort of get with the program. This is what your true nature is. But the Buddha very kindly described not just you could say, the delights of realization, but also the reality of being stuck in confusion, and also the realities of the path. And that's where we have a very clear outlining of how samsara takes place, where it comes from, what it looks like, and why we'd want to get out of samsara, and then the path in terms of what needs to be done on the path. And there it also takes into consideration that we might, mess up. And that's where we have the practices of amendment, simply just exposing our shortcomings, our failing in our path, and then amending it, getting back on track. So there's not like either you do it or you're finished, or nirvana or bust. It's simply just that understanding there's a very predictable human situation of again being caught in habitual patterns. So that's why the whole practice of what we call amendment, or parting from our shortcomings, confession, we sometimes call it. This is simply just taking into this compassionately takes into consideration our human predicament, our habitual patterns, if you like. So we've last time covered, also including sections from Jakob Rinpoche, about how to purify when we fail on the path. And of course, this is also, you could say, in many ways culturally situated, because many of us won't have access to all of this. But then again, it is, you could say, taken care of in the practices that we do have, such as Vajrasattva. And some of you might be familiar with the practice of the 35 Buddhas confession. So there are, you could say, simple ways of doing this, but in this context, since there's reference to these texts and sources, then I thought it would be good to include that. And so we get some idea of the wealth of the path and of the, you could say, application of the teachings. Now we're going to look at, so we've looked at what not to do. Now we're going to look at what to do, the precepts to be implemented. And so there's the 4 precepts of aspiration bodhicitta. So this is, you could say, 4 aspects that are all about us developing the enlightened attitude, the Mönpa Semkye, or aspiration bodhicitta. So the first one is taking suffering and giving happiness. So we can see Jigme Lingpa's root text, which then says, perfectly to give our happiness to others, taking on ourselves the burden of their pain, contriving thus the wondrous bravery of taking and receiving, that beings till they gain enlightenment should never be unhappy. This indeed should be our constant aspiration. So this is where sometimes people say, oh, fake it till you make it. No, we have that. We shouldn't underestimate our potential. We are naturally imbued with compassion. It just might sort of sometimes be a bit veiled by our neurosis and our, kleshas and karma. But nevertheless, it makes tremendous sense to connect to that dimension of ourselves and to be, courageous and think in these terms. And it's also not altogether unknown. Many of us have experienced love, or we've been at the receiving end of love, or we have some idea what love involves. And it's very often actually caring more for the other than oneself. And that's essentially what is being invoked here in the Mahayana context, in the context of the Bodhisattva training, the Bodhisattva path. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, it is important to be grounded in the sublime and courageous practice of giving and taking. So that's what we call Tonglen, and many of you would be familiar with it. This is the practice of exhaling all one's, you could say, wealth, good merit, qualities, and inhaling the suffering of others. So this is where, very often parents, they would very much rather suffer themselves than see their children suffering. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, using the rhythm of your breath, as you exhale, imagine that all your happiness, knowledge, and good qualities are given away to others so that they come to perfect development and fulfillment in them. Then, summoning all your strength, generate the thought that you yourself alone will patiently take their sorrows upon yourself. Imagine that others are set free from their pains and defects, and imagine that these same sufferings and faults are loaded into yourself, borne on the stream of your inhalation. Pray without ceasing that beings might be forever free from pain, and that they might never lose their happiness until they attain enlightenment. So this is big. It's something that we can apply in terms of just our practice, ordinary practice, and it's immensely helpful in so many situations where we're helpless, where we can't do anything, but then we can practice this, and it is an entirely different attitude in terms of our capacity. Because even though we might not be able to effectively take the suffering of others, to simply just wish that we could take the suffering of others, to simply just wish that they had our well-being, that in itself makes an enormous shift in what you could say the energy or the attitude and what we bring to a situation. So that's the first precepts, which is then this practice of Tonglen. And this you see reference to in many places. And for example, in the Longchen Yingting Nundro, and I think in several Nundros, then we practice this as part of the section on the bodhicitta in the Nundro. So then stanza 11 reads, of aspiration bodhicitta, the precepts are the four unbounded attitudes. Gratitude for kindness received gives birth to love. From love derives compassion, and from this bodhicitta is born. All this is well established in trustworthy texts. So this is, you can say, Tonglen is a big thing to do, right? So that's, and the whole, you could say, mentality of the Mahayana is enormous in terms of its shift, in terms of its greatness, its magnanimity, its courage. But that's where also there's some ways to develop this. So here Kangyur Rinpoche, commenting on Jigme Lingpa's verse, then says, train your mind in the perfect attitude of the four boundless qualities and in the equalization and exchange of self and other. So the four boundless you would be familiar with. We've already looked at them in the context of this text. And these are then loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And we do this recognizing that others are equal to us in that all beings want to be happy. All beings have ultimately the same agenda. And it doesn't matter what they might do. This is, you can say, some people say, oh, I don't want to live, or I wouldn't want to be happy. This is a point that if you read Matthew Ricard's The Art of Happiness, he quotes how some intellectuals in Europe, they would think, gosh, to have a happy life, that would be so bland and boring. Pain is what really drives our you could say, creativity and intelligence. Very often you hear this, but that's the same thing. That's again, wanting creativity then on the basis of pain. That's again the same thing of just wanting, something. There's a want that takes place. Even some, like there was recently in one of the commentaries on Woolston gave commentary on I can't remember, in the, I think it was 41 or 42 of the commentary on the trilogy. And he mentions actually desire as being constituted by not just wanting what we want, and not just wanting, but also sometimes wanting, you could say, wanting to be free of suffering, and then also sometimes just wanting extinction. But even that, even though we might want, I don't want to be here anymore, you know, the thoughts that people might sometimes have, you know, we might feel that our life is purposeless, or some might feel like that. That wish for extinction is also a form of desire, and it's also the cause of rebirth. And that's why it wouldn't help, because that drive towards wanting something is still there. And that's where all beings, no matter how it looks like and what shape it takes, they're all equal in wanting happiness. And then there's going further than just recognizing this, which is actually then being there fully for others and wishing, like we have in the practice of Tonglen, to take their unhappiness and give our own happiness. See what the footnote says here. For an extensive treatment of this subject, see The Way of the Bodhisattva, chapter 8, stanzas 90 to 98 and 141 to 154, and the commentary of Kenshin Kunzang Palden, translated in the same volume. So I had a look at that, and it's very extensive. So actually that I won't go into that. So, but you know, Khenpo Kunzang Palden's commentary, the Nectar Speech of Manjushri, is such a gem. So it's definitely worth looking at, but it's very extensive. I was reading these sections, and it goes into a lot of detail. So we'll pass on that one. Anyway, with this in mind, the four boundless, the equalization, and the exchanging self of others, then this means, Kangyur Rinpoche then writes, remembering the goodness that all beings have shown you, who from beginningless time have repeatedly been your parents and done the very best for you. The ensuing wish to repay their kindness gives rise to love. So we might forget this, and in the modern context, we very often have this sort of blame game, where if we're not feeling satisfied, we look for somebody to blame, and this very often becomes those that are close to us, and particularly then parents, because we believe in just one life. This is sort of the materialist view. You have no existence before then you become this physical aggregation. Then whatever you are is entirely shaped by your present life. Because in the Buddhist context, we would say, yeah, present life plays some part, but only a fraction. I remember one of Chögyam Trungpa's students quoting Chögyam Trungpa said, yeah, this life constitutes 25%. The previous life, 75%. So that's where there's a very different perspective. And as such, then also the parents that we have, they're not just sort of there. They're there because we have karmic connection and the karmic conditions for that particular scenario. So that's where we, rather than focus on parents as, you could say, an objects of those, you could say, not blaming, but, you know, saying, oh, I'm completely a product of my parents, then the perspective is a lot vaster. And that's where you then, in terms of parents, then simply look about the fact that here we are in samsara, continually connecting with all sorts of beings. And it happens to be that the beings that we connected with in this life, who took on the role of being our parents, have actually done a lot for us, where we look at things like them looking after us when we were small and so forth. And this will be elaborated in the text. But anyway, that's where we have this term, this attitude that we view parents as those who have repeatedly done their very best for us. So that's where there's this wish to repay their kindness. And that brings about love, this wishing beings, all beings having been our parents at one point or another, that they are happy. And then it says, from love springs compassion, which is then the wish that they be free from suffering. And this in turn gives birth to bodhicitta. And that's then where we look not just at our own wish to be happy, our own wish to be free from samsara, but actually the wish to free all beings from samsara, which is how Shantideva defines bodhicitta, simply the wish to establish all beings in awakening, in enlightenment. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, this is the teaching of the authentic scriptures of the Mahayana Pitakas, and was expounded in the causal sequence by Lord, and was expounded in a causal sequence by Lord Atisha, the master from Bengal, in his 7-point instruction. So this is where then we have this in all the Mahayana scriptures, and this is then taught in a causal sequence. You could say in a way that facilitates our learning, a heuristic approach by Lord Atisha. And Atisha is very often associated with what we call the 7-point mind training. This one here is different. This is not the 7-point mind training, but it is another 7-point instruction. So here it says the sequence is, first, the acknowledgement that all beings have been one's mother. Okay, now that's like we repeatedly come back to, this is where we need to sort of get out of, you could say, the limitation of a materialist science that we are brought up with, that thinks in terms of we're just, nothing but physical matter. And what we perceive as consciousness is just some neurons that are firing. Some of the most famous neuroscientists nowadays would say, oh, but there is no real consciousness. There's just the illusion of consciousness. There's just neurons that give the impression of some individuality and individual experience. So that's where we beg to differ here in this context and identify the primacy of consciousness as a fact, and the physical as secondary, the re-embodiment lifetime after lifetime as being the manifestation of consciousness. So that's where that is, you could say, us as in the modern world, that's our homework before we then embrace this understanding. But once we have that, then yes, then we got to say, well, every embodiment I've had must have been looked after by somebody and been born by somebody. And so that's where then we begin with saying, hey, I'm living in a place where all these sentient beings, all these people out there, all these individuals, all these persons, whether they're humans or birds or ants, they have at one point been one's kind mother. So that's the first one, biggie, but essential. The second, the remembrance of their kindness. And that's where we can probably draw on our experience in this life, or we can understand what we've seen other parents do, or we ourselves might be parents and know what it takes. So the remembrance of their kindness, number 2. Third, a sense of gratitude towards them. Somebody brings us flowers or somebody brings us a box of chocolate. We're like, oh, thank you. That's so kind of you. You needn't have, Or somebody maybe helps us pay the rent. Wow, thank you so much. That got me over this bump. Or somebody helps us, when we've had an accident. We're immensely grateful. So that's where gratitude is something that we very easily have and very often have. But this is gratitude in an enormous degree, really. Gratitude for individuals who have spent years thinking of us, caring for us, being worried for us, looking after us to the best of their capacity. So that's the sense of gratitude towards them and a desire to repay their kindness. Fourth, the experience of loving warmth towards them. So that not just that we do it as a gesture, oh, let me repay your kindness. We just like it's some sort of economic transaction. Oh, you did this for me, now I'll do that for you. You whatever, you did the dishes yesterday, let me do the dishes today, or whatever it is, you know. But actually here, much more the loving warmth, and that's where this becomes, you know, this becomes something extremely precious and beautiful. There's not an economy. There's simply just an outgoing of warmth. Fifth, the feeling of tender compassion towards them, wishing them to be free of suffering. Sixth, the extraordinary attitude of universal responsibility, of caring for all sentient beings. And then seventh, the unsurpassable result, which is the attitude of bodhicitta. And out of that comes then not just, you know, these warm sentiments and compassionate sentiments, but also this understanding of the universality of this, and there from there then the wish to establish all beings at the level of enlightenment. So this is where we have this, you could say, very skillful way of engendering the conditions for bodhicitta. So the first, to recognize that all beings have been one's mother. There is not a single living being who has not, at one time or another, been joined to us in a relationship of mother and child. As the Master Nagarjuna has said, were I to make a pill of mud, just berry-sized, for every mother who has given me birth, the earth itself would not suffice. So we have to think big. And this is also the kind of thoughts that we have when we look up at the sky at night and think, where does the universe end? Or we begin to think, when did time begin? And that's where it's not enough that we just think, oh, well, you know, in history, I learned from, you know, the time of the old Greeks, or, you know, the Harappan culture in India, and think that's time. That's what we know, or the Ice Age, or the beginning of the Big Bang, and so on. These kind of rather limited perceptions of time just always prompt the question, what was before? And these sort of understandings of the vastness of space, however far you might think, you can just keep thinking, well, what's beyond that? So that's similarly also then with regards to our number of births. So that's where, having understood then the nature of rebirth and the nature of how our consciousness creates and re-embodies itself, yes, then we just think, wow, when did this all begin? So it becomes vast. So this is where we need to think big. So that was to recognize that all beings have been one's mother. Then the next is to reflect on the kindness of all mother sentient beings. So Omniscient Jigme Lingpa, he says then, as soon as she gives birth, a mother takes her babe, an ugly imp, upon her lap contrived now as a washing place, and with soft hands she cleans away its filth. With her own milk she nurses it and wraps it in her body's warmth. She'd rather die than her little one fall ill, and for her child she is able to endure sin, pain, and cruel words. To disregard one's mother's kindness and her loving care is anything more evil, more degenerate. The earth with all its mountains would be slight to bear. Far greater is the weight of failing to repay her kindness. To do so is to be like one who swallows poisoned food. So this is a biggie, and it's a biggie in terms of, you could say, what the value of it in terms of our spiritual path. And it's also a biggie because for us in the modern world, it actually means departing for something that in the cultural discourse is taken for granted. Yeah, you have your parents and they're kind of, you know, first they're a drag and then you have to look after them. And, you know, you spend years getting over issues with the parents and so on. Or, you know, I'm shaped by my parents, traumatized by my parents, and so on. There's a whole way that is very, very common. I think many have experienced really good parents, but also there's an incredibly common tendency towards the way that we psychologize ourselves, and as such also begin to see that whatever is not functioning is something that has to do with our upbringing and the past. There's sort of this reluctance to actually identify the autonomy and the empowerment that we have in terms of our present experience. You know, there's so much that's sort of like the past, you know, that shapes us. And of course, that's true to a large extent, but also there is so much empowerment in terms of recognizing what we can do now in terms of shifting our attitude. So these are the kind of, you could say, things that we have to shake up and you could say loosen up a bit in terms of us who come from the modern culture. Some really strong assumptions here. It's a little bit different in Asia. And that's where the wording of the text here reflects a culture that already takes for granted that, yes, it's normal to actually have this gratitude toward one's parents. But what it then comes with, something that extends beyond the sort of even that acknowledgement, is the degree, because we don't have clear memories of it. Obviously, most of us can't remember back to, you know, beyond a certain age. And that's where we need to reflect. Yes, at that time, our mother, our parent, would have actually looked after ourselves. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, as soon as a baby is born, its mother unhesitatingly takes it on her knees, this unclean worm, this evil-looking imp-like creature, and making a basin, so to speak, of her own lap, she gently wipes away the baby's dirt with her own hands, afraid that the cloth would be too coarse. Now, let's just be clear here. The person who's writing this was father of 7 children and very involved. Kangyur Rinpoche was a doctor, and he was very involved with his own children at the time of birth and the early stages. And by the way, many of you would be interested to know that in the 1960s, a Frenchman called Frédéric Le Boyer instigated a complete shift in how birthing was to take place, which in the modern context very often took place in a hospital setting with very bright lights and a very brutal way of actually handling a newborn kid, you know, pull it out and sort of make sure that it gets a little bit of a smack so it starts breathing, and in general, an incredibly traumatic experience for the child. But, you know, the medical profession then was just thinking, oh, well, you know, it's just a little kid, doesn't feel much, you know, just get it going. But actually, Frédéric Le Boyer instigated a revolution in terms of identifying the need for the kid to actually arrive gently. And where did he get this from? Well, he got it from Kangyur Rinpoche. This is a very important historical detail around birth. And please let your friends know that Frédéric Le Boyer's gentle childbirth comes from Kangyur Rinpoche. And my friends who spent time with Kangyur Rinpoche, they knew Frédéric Le Boyer. He would come out to Gandhi Road 54, and he studied with Kangyur Rinpoche and received Kangyur Rinpoche's advice on birth. So when Kangyur Rinpoche is sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek about the sort of the nature of a newborn child, it's certainly not from compassion. And in fact, Kangyur Rinpoche's advice has actually impacted the whole way that you could say childbirthing is viewed in the modern world. So keep that in mind, okay? But that's where there's a strong compassion for the kid, for the child that's being fed, but also then the recognition of the mother. And so the infant is unable to take solid food, and so she feeds it with her own milk, giving it her body's warmth and doing all that she can to make the child comfortable and happy. Her greatest terror is the death of her child, a fear closely followed by that of sickness. And she is constantly anxious that the child might be hungry, thirsty, or cold. She does everything to protect her baby from harm, preferring to die herself. Then her child might fall ill. For her child's sake, she will become angrily protective and will bear all difficulties, putting up with heat and cold and every kind of insult. To disregard the kindness of one's mother is thus the worst, the most shocking, and the most degenerate behavior imaginable. It is therefore said that to carry on one's back the whole universe, weighed down by Mount Meru and the peaks of iron that surround the great ocean, is nothing compared with the load of suffering that will result from the failure to repay the kindness of one's mother. Such suffering is counted as endless and inexhaustible, as if one's whole body were engulfed in virulent poison. As it is said in the Vinaya Vibhanga, the earth and seas and mountains, their weight for me is light. That I did not repay her good is now my heavy load. So I think I'm going to stop here today. But this is a big one anyway. We've covered some big subjects, actually. And I'm not too much, we shouldn't rush through this. To engender this attitude is something that makes all the difference. And particularly then with regards to the way that we view our mother. So, and also fathers to some extent, mainly mothers. I remember when Dingwachen's Rinpoche came to Denmark, first time, only time actually that he visited Denmark. It was the spring of, what was it, January or February 1976. And he knew that the Westerners, they had already picked up on the Western trouble with their attitude towards their parents. So he said, okay, if you can't do that, at least think of all sentient beings then as your children. And already many people then had kids. You know, they understood that love does take place, selfless love does take place in that relationship. Okay, no questions? All right. Okay. Well, look, that's fine then. And let's see here. Just thinking, when is it that it might be that next time again, might be that that next time we might skip next time because it's the miracle day. Yeah, Chom tradition. So we won't be doing the class next Saturday because at the same time there will be, I think it's on here at this time, then Ani Zangmo in Australia will be leading the practice of the practice related that we would do on the what's called the Chom tradition, the Day of Miracles, celebrating the Day of Miracles. Yeah. So. So we'll meet in 2 weeks' time. Okay. Thank you. I'll just conclude with dedication. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.